Well, let's go. Well, thank you all for joining us for a fascinating webinar, The Virtuous Circle of Fund Marketing, Branding, Content, CRM, and Marketing Automation. Combined, these four dynamics help create a powerful tool for asset managers to gain exposure, grow assets, and retain clients. We have several fascinating panelists with us today. From around the world, actually, we have Andrew Nelson from Dynamo here in Boston, where I am located at the moment. We have Warren Kelly from Basis Point in South Africa, and we have Paul Doss from London, ProFundCom, our host. So using the miracle of modern technology, we're able to bring the world together. So let's start with what this virtuous circle is all about. It is the best unified practice of marketing teams in the asset management and the fund management business and what they can do for their enterprises. The virtuous circle unites branding, where potential clients know who you are before you even begin the discussion. It adds in content marketing, which builds trust and solutions for clients so they're ready to engage. It applies CRM, the latest technology, in keeping track of all your content, and then marketing automation, which helps systematize, personalize, and accelerate how you reach out to clients. So, gentlemen, to start, why don't you briefly introduce yourselves? Paul, how about a couple of sentences on your perspective?
So my perspective with all these things is, no matter what technology you use, no matter what buzzwords you choose to pick out the ether, if as a marketing function, you're not targeting raising assets or preserving assets, and you don't have the systems and processes in places to do that, you'll never get a pay rise, you'll never get budgets that you want, and you'll always be the poor cousin in the organization. And it's one of those things, that I've found in the last 30 years is that, marketing is never seen as a core function of any business. And those people that say marketing isn't a core function are the people walking around with iPhones. So, and I say iPhones as in they've been marketed something at an exorbitant price, and that has some subjective value that they don't even know what it is. So I think that's my view on this, is that you've got to find a way to demonstrate that marketing is adding value to the whole asset raising and asset preserving process in a fund.
So, Warren, why don't you tell us a bit about your firm and what you'd like people to go away with today?
So Basis Point is a strategic marketing firm. We service global investment managers. And my role there as a copywriter and strategist, I'm essentially helping firms, create messaging that resonates, that that carries, that people like to kind of keep spreading through the market. So today I'm going to be focusing a lot on developing narrative. I think that's touching on what Paul said there. I think something that's kind of not really hasn't gained, I think, enough traction in our space is the importance of narrative development. And then we'll talk a little bit on execution. So once you know your story, well, how do you tell that story? And then a little bit on distribution as well. So once you're telling a good story, how do you get it out there?
Excellent. And Andrew, what brings you to our gang of four today?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. And appreciate you guys having me today. So Dynamo Software, we provide broadly software to the entire alternative asset universe. In my role, I focus on our relationships with our hedge fund clients worldwide. And mostly they're utilizing Dynamo as a CRM platform to assist with marketing, fundraising, investor relations, all the way through to investor reporting. So I'll talk about the ways that you can leverage CRM and other technology to ultimately deliver that message out to your client base and prospects that you're working with, how you can kind of utilize certain automations and features within CRM to streamline your processes, make it more efficient, be able to leverage a team in a better way. And ultimately some of the mistakes that folks sometimes encounter as they interact with the CRM platform.
Okay, so it seems like part of the process is technology, is hardware, it's the piping, and then part of it is the software, the narrative, the branding, and the content. And Warren, you've already mentioned the word narrative. I know, Paul, you have some pretty strong thoughts on it. Most people in the asset management believe that the process begins with a portfolio, or if they go into sales and marketing, they think it starts with a pitch deck, a fact sheet, and maybe a website. But the word narrative comes up. Paul, why don't you give us your perspectives on the importance of narrative in our industry? I think we lost your audio.
I think, Mark, have you got me back now?
There we go. There we are.
Yeah, I think my perspective on narrative is, we're a technology house, right? If we build a platform that enables people to do fund marketing, if you haven't built your narrative, you are wasting your time with your website, your pitch deck, and anything else after that. And I think this is really where the guys at Basis Point, they kind of come in, because, whenever we go and we talk about marketing technology and the marketing stack, most people will say, hey, I've got a website and that's it. And they're sitting back and wondering, built the website, spent loads of money on a website, and are wondering, and obviously they went with the cheapest provider, obviously. So they're kind of going, well, where is all the leads? And they're not really understanding, the kind of the work that, people like, Basis Point and Warren do, where they're building that narrative. And I think without that narrative, it's almost, buying a Ferrari and just putting normal unleaded fuel in it. You're never really going to get the benefit. And then because you haven't done that heavy lifting, of building out your narrative, building out your brand, then 7 years later, the same thing happens again. We need a new website, we need a new CRM, we need a new marketing automation platform. And that's the cycle people see. And the reason is, why I've got strong views on this is that you've got to have companies like who understand building narrative, understand building brand. And it's so hard to explain this kind of marketing, the mystical marketing machine to fund managers, because most fund managers are economists by trade, mathematicians by trade, numbers guys. They don't really understand color palettes and tones and voice, and they just don't understand it. So if somebody's explaining it to them and it costs money, they're thinking, well, I can do that cheaper, and as we know, there's cheaper and there's quality, and those two, do not meld together.
Warren,
just to add to what Paul's saying there, I think there'll be a lot of people on this call who work for funds that have got good performance, and they will know someone, they'll know a peer who has not inferior performance, but they've got worse performance than they do, and their assets will be much larger. I think every fund manager out there knows a peer that's got more assets than them that hasn't performed as well. So there's obviously lots of factors that contribute to that, but I think the key one is storytelling. So we can get into the nuts and bolts of how to create a story. I think there's, obviously we've got a limited amount of time today, so we want to be as practical as possible, give people takeaways that they can use to build narratives. I don't know if that's a good place to start.
Well, that's actually a very big place to start. A lot of managers start with the same phrases. If you were to do a statistical study of what happens in manager narratives, and people have done this, it's the same collection of phrases. A disciplined approach, deep research. It doesn't matter what the asset class is, the words are the same. So
Yeah.
how does a manager, if you can give us a brief answer, how does a manager create a differentiated narrative? One that tells investors how different that manager is and what the value proposition is and how it can positively impact the investor
Sure.
return stream.
So Rick, I think the big thing here, and this is the starting point, right, is that managers have to get comfortable with not being liked by some of their audience. And I say this is important because if you try and create a narrative that spreads the net really, really wide, you're going to appease people, but you're not really going to entice them into action. You're not going to get them engaged. So it's almost this, I talk a lot about authenticity and specificity in our messaging, and that for me is key, because when you do that, yes, you're going to isolate some people, but then you'll also really, really resonate with some of your target audience. And I think that's what you want. So authenticity and specificity are very important. And then when you're crafting a story, I think you want to cover three things in general. So who are you? What do you do? And how do you do it? Now, people who follow Simon Sinek will notice that I've subbed out the how and the why. I don't think the why is particularly relevant in the asset management or fund management industry. There are certain funds that will, we're working with a private equity firm at the moment that is, they focus on climate tech. So there's a little bit of a why behind that. But most of the time, we're just looking to make money for the end beneficiary. So I think how is more important, because that's going to give your investors insight into why they need you. I think that's important. But just to go back to those three things, so who you are, what you do, and how you do it. I think who you are, again, you want to be specific enough that your reader's going to have almost a Me Too moment where they're going to be like, oh, I also think about things like that way. Or, I also believe this, or I am based in this city, or I went to this university, or you want to give them touch points where they can see themselves in your business. So I think, again, don't be generic, be specific about who you are, stand up for your beliefs, etc., etc. What you do is your strategy and then your performance deliverable. So, what kind of performance are you going to deliver for your end investor? And I think this is an important point, because a lot of managers will say our differentiator is performance. I don't think that's the right approach, because first off, performance will inevitably go through a dip. And when that happens, your investor, who will probably be anxious, has nothing to hold on to. They've got nothing to say, okay, they're going through bad performance, but I know what they're doing and I believe in what they do. And then from a marketing perspective, word of mouth is still a very, very powerful tool. And if your pitch is performance is our differentiator, when someone is telling that story to somebody else, they're going to say, okay, their performance has been really, really good. And then someone's going to say, well, how do they do it? And they'll be like, well, I don't really know. And it's the end of the conversation, and it's not interesting, and it's not memorable. So I don't think performance is a differentiator. I think that's something that we see a lot of. And I think there's a good example I can share here of a private equity firm that we're working with at the moment to touch on each of these things. So I can't share too much on who they are, because I'll probably get into hot water for doing that. But they are a private equity firm who focuses on mid-market cyclical businesses, buying them at around about a 6.5 multiple. So it's very specific. They are defensive about the industries that they focus on. So they only focus on cyclical industries. They're not apologetic about it. That's what we are. That's what we do. So they're being authentic. They're telling people what they do and what they don't do. Again, important, because you're going to isolate some people. Maybe they want tech. They're not going to get tech with this business. And then when it comes to their differentiator, how do they pick up these businesses at such great multiples? Well, they've got this amazing culture where everybody is just a data capturer. Every single person, from the CIO down to the most junior analyst, they buy into this culture where they're collecting data all the time and storing it in this very sophisticated database. And with the advent of AI and ML, this is just becoming a bigger and bigger advantage that's non-replicable. No one can just come and repeat that. So it's specific, it's authentic, and then their differentiator is, it's something that just, yeah, it's unique, it's different. And I think every business has got something like this. It gets a bit lost in a lot of the jargon and a lot of the catchphrases you were talking about earlier, Rick.
So advisors and asset managers need to think about what makes me different? What is my unique story and narrative that will resonate with the audience? And that segues into the concept of brand. And brand as a retail concept sometimes feels alien in the asset management business. But what is brand really about in the money world? Is it about what investors think about you before you even talk to them, what they naturally know? How would you define brand? And I ask this of all of you, and what makes a great brand in the fund and asset management world?
I think, the asset management world is so competitive. So for me, a strong brand is, something that's going to draw people in. It's going to build credibility and trust, and it's going to give your audience something to talk about. They're going to want to go out into the market and tell people about your strategy. Again, I go back to word of mouth. It's just such a powerful tool, because there's obviously a big gap between when you first see a firm and when you pull the trigger to invest with them. And if somebody close to you is vouching for a firm, it's super powerful. So I think those are the kind of key things: attract people, build credibility, build trust, and give people something to talk about. So I think practically, what does that mean? Well, it means don't skimp on design. I think that's the first thing. I think Paul alluded to this earlier. It's your first impression, and in today's market, the leaders are taking this seriously. So if your design is not up to scratch, you're on the back foot. And I think psychologically, bad impressions are very difficult to overcome, and it's just not a hurdle that you need. So spend good money on design. And then the consistency of how you tell your story, so who you are, what you do, and how you do it. I think you've got to make sure that across your collateral, there's threads of all of that messaging. So you build consistency. People like consistency. It puts them at ease. It makes it easier for them as well to retell your story. Then on even a more granular level, I think one of the key mistakes we see from fund managers is that they over-explain things. We get lots of pitch decks that look like DDQs because they're just worried something's going to get missed, so they put everything in there. I think most audiences I don't think they get enough credit. We try and spoon feed things to them, whereas they can actually connect the dots themselves. So I think that's important. And then obviously the side effect of that is that you have more space for great design. And that's important. You also want to leave a bit of mystery, right? You don't want to tell them everything, because then they don't have a reason to get in touch with you. So I think, give your audience more credit, hold some stuff back, and keep your language, minimalistic. And then finally, sorry, go ahead.
It's that famous quote, isn't it, from another bald brother, Johnny Ive, who says, "Design builds trust." And when they go about building stuff at Apple, which is the epitome of marketing, right? It's their design. You open up a Mac, you open up a product, there is everything that it does tells you, I'm very comfortable paying for this overpriced product, but it's in everything. And I think, and whilst some managers won't maybe connect with what you're saying, to just paraphrase, when they open their new iPhone 16 later on this year, that's going to be $3,500 to buy, they'll be like, oh, there's something in that design. And design, there's a lot to be said for design. So I just thought I'll just throw that one in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree.
So in addition to story and narrative, design becomes the visual milieu that delivers the essence of the money manager. And if the visuals don't work, Is it hard for the investor to engage?
It's again, I think it's just you're just creating friction that you don't want. It's the margins in this space are between success and failure are so small that you just want to be on the front foot all the time. So I don't think it makes it difficult to engage. I just think you're going to get less engagement. A good analogy here is you often hear people talking about how you speak, how you deliver things is more important than the actual content. So this hurts me because I'm a copywriter and a strategist, so I write. But I think there's so much truth in that. And when it comes to the digital space, your design is how you are speaking to your end investor. So it is critical. I don't think you can make exceptional messaging effective without it. So a lot of our clients, we start with content because content it creates the framework for good design, but the design is where the money's made, I think.
Okay. A point to remember. So in this virtuous cycle, we started out with story, narrative, brand, and all its elements. We've talked about messaging. So that takes us to content. And content for many money managers is their last quarterly investment report. What makes a difference between useful content that keeps investors engaged and educated and makes them feel like they're getting value,
Yes.
and just obligatory content? And how does that feed the virtuous cycle of marketing?
Yeah. So to be honest, with the clients that we work with, I haven't seen a lot of managers who are really nailing the content marketing. I think that's the reality. I think, when it comes to content marketing in particular, I'm not sure that quarterly letters typically fall into that because they tend to be very information led around what's just happened. But if you are weaving in your story and your beliefs into that content, I think then it becomes a little bit more powerful. Again, that requires a little bit of courage because you've got to write stuff that is, sometimes a little bit vulnerable, sometimes a little bit raw, a little bit authentic. I think that's what people connect with. In an age where we're going to see a lot of content that's developed by AI, it's going to be very clean, very polished. I think that makes it even more important that when we are developing content, it's human. So I think that's a key starting point. I would love to see more of the leaders in businesses becoming writers, becoming content publishers, and there are people who do this. I mean, two examples that I think get people who really get this right. Not sure if I should be sharing this on here, but we can share these names. It's Vitaly Katzenelson he's a CEO of an investment firm called IMA. So if you go onto his Substack account, you'll see the investor letters that he puts out, and they're exceptional. So that's a good example of how you build trust and credibility and familiarity with an investor base. And people are fund managers are very scared of sharing views because if it turns out to be wrong, then they're worried about the repercussions of that. But you can write in a way that you're not drawing a line in the sand and saying we write about this, write about that. You can write in a way that gives you a little bit of credibility and space to get things wrong. So I think that's a big thing. I think content marketing, specifically when you are talking about developing content outside of the mandatory publications, I think you only really get into that when you have a plan, you have a budget, you have the human resources to put behind it. I've seen a lot of people start and not finish, and then it becomes a liability. Then it's just something that has fallen by the wayside, and it doesn't send a good message. So I think there's a lot of work and planning that goes up to getting to the point where you can develop content and publish it. And then I think it comes down to, in particular, being authentic in your writing and being human. And that's what's gonna resonate. No one's gonna No one's going to read AI generated content and and feel deeply like they understand the end investor. I think we need to be human.
And Paul, you're a writer and content creator. I mean, your book last year, over the past couple of years, it's already been through multiple editions, The Invisible Investor. It seems like you've naturally, intuitively understood the concept that people in asset management are also in the media business. They're in the publication.
Yeah, I kind of look at it, and when I'm writing, I do three things. I educate, entertain, and enlighten, right? And entertain being, part of what Warren said is like the storytelling. How do you take something? How do you put your own spin on it? And when somebody reads what I've written, they know it's me because there'll be spelling mistakes, there'll be grammatical errors. Hey, because I'm a human, right? And the content that I see getting produced, ones that people think they're doing really well at is if it's over-engineered and overly personalized, and we're going to get some AI to like check this and check that and pull this in, so they can go to their boss and say, hey, I've got an AI strategy. I'm writing an AI and we're doing some machine learning and we've got some Bayesian data being put into all this kind of stuff, like buzzword bingo as they go along. And we all know when AI has written something, we know those LinkedIn posts. So all these things, you're putting your personality into things, you're entertaining, you're enlightening, and it goes back to what Warren was saying, is that performance isn't everything, right? And I have something written on my whiteboard over there, and it says it's not the best fund that wins, it's the best known fund that wins. Now, how you get there is all these things that we're talking about today. And really what my book talks about is really that the investor is invisible. You're not meeting them at game, you're not meeting them, in Miami. You are meeting them through various digital touch points, and aggregating them through your CRM is the only way that you can really connect and join all these dots together. Because the thing is, Warren, I know, is not cheap, and there's a budget that a client allocates to him, and the question they'll ask basis point is, what have you done for me lately? And hopefully they can then go to their CRM and say, hey, this is the marketing attribution that has been generated through the work that basis points have done. So and that's how these kind of virtuous, I know that's the topic today, but that's the virtuous connection. It's kind of the work that Warren does and how that kind of dovetails into the work that Andrew and his team does.
So we've talked a lot about the software, the story, the narrative, the brand, the content, the engagement. Well, let's move on to the technology. You're reaching a whole variety of investors. That gets you to the CRM. So, Andrew, people tend to think of CRM as a digital Rolodex, but what makes a truly effective CRM?
Sure. So that's a good question, Rick. I think if you look back years ago when CRM was first coming out as a buzzword, it really was a place to store your contacts, your activities, emails, phone calls, meeting notes with those contacts. But it's certainly morphed beyond that, right? So nowadays, you'll certainly store a lot of data in the system, but it's also a mechanism to farm that data, right? To help understand, as you deliver messages, who's interacting with those messages, what messages are being most interacted with, what is most resounding, but then also a mechanism to deliver content through, whether it's via a mass mailing that you're sending out, whether it's via an integrated portal, right? A good CRM nowadays is offering all of those things, where it is truly morphed beyond kind of what has traditionally been known as a CRM system, right? We don't like to refer to Dynamo always as a CRM. It's a much larger platform than that. And particularly within this industry, there's a lot of very unique kind of workflows and activities on a day-to-day basis that a fund manager's business and operations team will be conducting. And hopefully the CRM becomes that common source of truth, where you're integrating all sorts of data from external sources, from proprietary information that you're creating or content that you're creating, and having to be that one, kind of area that your team can enter and control the message through.
So a truly effective CRM today is far more than a digital Rolodex. It's data that you can harvest to help drive the activities of your sales team. And what you're also describing is it can also be integrated with your entire digital presence. So it's naturally gathering all the interactions you might have with prospective investors, actual investors, and how they're engaging with your content.
Yeah,
So-
yes. Sorry, go. One thing to add.
Did I get that right?
I mean,
Please.
ultimately, you don't want your team to have to log into 5 to 10 different systems, right? It's inefficient. It's time consuming. It's going to ultimately lead to people not kind of actually doing it, right? So you're going to end up with your sales team or your investor relations team operating blindly or without key pieces of information. So certainly it is kind of the culmination of gathering all of your content and delivering that through that in one spot, but also being able to pull in things like investor intent data, for instance, from a Preqin or a Dakota, right? Who's the investor, where are they located, who are the contacts that work there, what are they interested in investing into? So you're not wasting your time on an investor that might not be a great fit. Certainly you want a large universe within your CRM, but you want your team, especially when you're trying to stretch the dollar a little bit, you want your team to be able to be targeted with their approach, right? And being able to pull all of the data into one common place, be able to slice and dice through that allows them to do so.
So Dynamo's been involved with this for years. What do you see as the most important new innovations in CRM?
That's a
for
good
the asset
question.
management industry?
So, I think, the common buzzword that we see nowadays is with everything is AI, right? So there's certainly, I think, this push nowadays where, again, traditionally CRM has largely been viewed as a data repository. And now it's trying to say, how do we harness all of the data that we have to make, kind of actionable insights, into that data. So here at Dynamo, for instance, we're doing a lot of work on the AI front, things like, auto summarization of activities, being able to look at sentiment of, kind of a relationship. Is the tenor of your communications with this investor improving, or is it going in the wrong direction? Also mechanisms even to get data into the system, right? One of the key problems that you see oftentimes, not only with CRM, but probably with any software, is user adoption, right? How do you get people to use the software that you're paying for? And oftentimes it comes down to how many clicks does it take to get something done? So, looking for a system that can help with frictionless or hopefully at some point in the future, zero data entry from a manual standpoint. That's some stuff that we're starting to experiment with, and we're certainly seeing that as a kind of a tough item to tackle in the industry that firms are dealing with. Just how do we get people to log in? In addition to that, I think user interface plays into that as well. So not just of course the AI to be able to automate certain things, but making it a simple and easy to use interface. An example I always give is we had a client years ago that wanted to come in and try and build all sorts of automations around task management. Any single time something occurred, that would create a task for someone on the team. Someone completing a task would create a task and create 3 more tasks after that. And it ultimately got to the point where users were coming in and they had 60 tasks to close out at the end of the day. And it became burdensome to them to the point where it hurt user adoption. Another item I see sometimes is people wanting to make sure that they capture every single data point about a particular record or interaction in the system, to the point where when there is a manual data entry element, they're requiring 15, 20, 30 fields to be entered to actually create a record, which is great. Everyone wants clean data, but at some point perfect becomes the enemy of good, and ultimately hurts user adoption. So Another thing that we see, as a driving force, especially when people are selecting the CRM, is what does it look like and how easy is it to use? So the UX and the UI is, I think, certainly a differentiator that people are looking for nowadays. Whereas, again, years ago, there weren't probably a ton of options, and it was as simple as, I just need a place to store my emails. So that's definitely a change in the industry.
Yeah, I think that from a tech perspective as well, I think there is a counter to that, is where it's not just the user experience, it's kind of the user support experience, because nobody in our industry, when they're sending some commentary out, or they're trying to fill a workflow, they don't want to talk to an AI agent, because the AI agent has no clue what's going, unless there's got no clue, and there's just general dissatisfaction with AI being used by generic, and I mention their names? No, I won't, because it's just generic, right? So you then end up speaking to a generic person, and that kind of level of support, that white glove support, people are actually asking for that, and we're finding that ourselves is people are moving away from the Goliaths of our industry, because they're kind of realizing it's too generic. The cost of ownership is huge. The cost of adoption is huge. Yes, it looks really great, but these are just Lego blocks that I have to assemble myself. So I think in answer to your question, Rick, yeah, and kind of comments on what you said there, Andrew, yeah, people are kind of going down the AI route, but AI to make their tasks easier. But when things go wrong, they don't want to talk to a bot and then get that famous answer, I can't answer this, I'm going to put you in touch with a human. And the human has got no idea themselves. So it's like, you know what? Buy cheap, buy twice.
And actually, I think, well, to add to that, Paul, one thing, you guys were talking about earlier is building a brand. And as a non-marketer, I have to raise my hand. I'm not a marketing guy, I'm a sales guy. One of the things I think, we talked a lot about, kind of the content creation and some of the visuals around it. But I think sometimes the element that might be forgotten is, brand is overall, how do you do business? How do you conduct yourself, right? And that, I heard you guys talk about trust and developing that trust. And I think not just CRMs, but just overall, I always hear the term, people want to institutionalize their business in the hedge fund space, in the alternative space overall, right? And how do you become an institutional, manager? And I think certainly part of that is the content and the messaging and the story that you tell, but it's also the systems that you put in place and the teams that you put in place, right? Oftentimes, whenever I train a new hire here at Dynamo on our kind of sales introduction team, I always remind them that when you think about a hedge fund, your first thought is these are people that invest, and that they forget that there's a business side to it as well, right? For our new hires, and I think managers, they have to look at when they're thinking about a CRM, I'll focus on that because that's what we do. Could you go with a lower cost solution, as you mentioned, Paul, or could you use Excel? Sure, that might check the box. You might have a place to store your contacts, but it doesn't present that institutional quality that you're trying to kind of present as a firm. And as folks are doing their operational due diligence, that comes across, right? They'll ask you what systems they're using. I've heard clients before that have actually come in and shown investors Dynamo, right? Because they want to show them that they're using a very institutional quality system. They are blown away by the information that's tracked in the system. It's the entire investor life cycle. It's from prospect acquisition all the way through, kind of maintaining a long-term client relationship, being able to pull in data from your fund administrator, be able to really understand your investor base. And, I think that all adds to the brand overall as well.
So, it's interesting. We've been moving along in our conversation from software and the human element to technology and automating this process. There's a lot of data points. There's a lot of actions that need to be taken. And in terms of creating the virtuous cycle, if we go from brand to content to CRM, the next step is marketing automation. In other words, what do you do with all this that you've created, and how many contacts can you reach and how frequently? So, Paul, what's your perspective on what successful marketing automation looks like? What should people expect? What should they be aspiring to?
It's very simple. First part, you need to have a brand and you've got to have a narrative. That's number one. Two, you've got to have a CRM in place where you've got to put all this data in. You've got to have content. Once you've got all that in place, and that is really, really hard work, right? Marketing automation is really simple, right? Our product gives you the ability to do all of that. But unless you've got those building blocks in place, right, it really is, it's a fool's errand. So assuming, you've got these systems in place, I think what marketing automation kind of gives you the ability to do is it kind of helps you with your go-to-market strategy, right? So with your go-to-market strategy, you've got multiple channels, you're sending out content, you're then analyzing, okay, who's engaging with our content, who's not engaging with our content. And that's very much the start of the journey. And then you've got kind of two branches. One is where you want to effectively do, sales enablement. So you want to be able to take this data and give, and people who are, where the iron is hot, is basically feed that via your CRM to your sales team. And that's reporting and one level of marketing automation. The second part of automation is really where you can look at all these data points and use, a bit of statistical analysis, also known nowadays as AI, a bit of behavioral analysis, and again, feed that back into the sales team to say, well, here is somebody who hasn't engaged with you for the last 6 months, but's engaging with you. So, give them a call. Here's an investor whose engagement has increased over time. Well, that's interesting. Pass them on to a salesperson. You can also, from automations, essentially have this thing where you're nurturing people. So they may not be ready to buy now, but they may be in a period of time. And, somebody asked me recently, what is marketing? That question that everybody, what is marketing? What is brand? Is the earth flat or is it round? All these things that nobody really knows about. So I kind of say, well, look, marketing, sales is easy, right? Sales is you're talking to the 5% of people that are going to buy your product, right? That's their job. That's what sales do. Marketing is getting ready for making sure the other 95% at some point will move into that 5%. And you do that through nurturing. And that's where automation comes in as well, where you're kind of drip feeding various types of content over periods of time to kind of say, right, here is what we do. And what's that thing that, you want to be consistent about, you want to be authentic about, you want to be, you want to have a great brand, all these things that we kind of, Warren was speaking about earlier on, it really ties into this. And, and automation is programmatic by nature. So there is an element where you've got to know a little bit of, workflow, a little bit of, flow chart, a bit of, if then else in your programming as you lay these automations out. But once you've done them, they literally become self-sustaining. But like with any machine, they need training as well. So, and that's the real AI within, workflows and within marketing automation. So that is really kind of what we kind of see as the benefits of marketing automation to fund managers. So yeah, that's kind of marketing automation and how it all ties it all together.
So we've now gone through the entire virtuous cycle, from brand and story and narrative to content to CRM to marketing automation. And if the process is mastered, there's a great elevation to the fundraising, sales and marketing, and client retention for asset managers. But looking forward, what do the masters of this process need to be concerned about? There's a tension between how technology allows you to do more and faster and the need for the human element. And sometimes the human element is forgotten in a marketing automation, and a prospect is getting all these random emails and content. They don't know why they're getting it. What's the best practice for uniting tech and humanity?
I can take a stab at that one, Rick, real quickly, just from a technical standpoint. We always like to suggest that people kind of start slow to a degree when they're trying to automate or build reports or whatever it may be. You have to learn to crawl before you can walk. And so, always try and go for the lowest hanging fruit. Doing something is better than doing nothing, but you don't have to, do it all at once. So we like to see, when we're going through implementations, people taking a phased approach, where they get their feet under them, and then also understanding that an implementation isn't final, right? So that, any system that you're using should always be evolving over time as your needs evolve, right? Or as the system becomes more advanced, right? And new features are released. So it's always thinking about this as a living state and trying to add on, but don't try and over-engineer early on. But I think it is important also to think about, when you're going through a decision on what systems you'll implement, don't think about just today. Think about, what will my firm look like if it is successful 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now down the road.
And
Rick, from a brand perspective there, if I can just chip in as well. I think it goes back again to almost not looking too polished. I think there's got to be some strong human elements, strong authenticity. I think that's kind of what's missing from a brand perspective at the moment. So yeah, making sure that your communications on that front are still sounding human, I think, is going to be very important.
And Paul, what's your perspective on this in terms of how to optimize the virtuous cycle?
I think optimizing, I think it's always, there are two ways you can do this. You can be a blind man in a dark room in an all-you-can-eat buffet, and you're hungry and you've got one arm. You can just be completely overwhelmed with the whole thing and not have the right tools or the right people in place to do it. But you're ticking a box. We're doing something. I think always start with the outcome in mind. I think that is probably key. And what outcomes do you want? Not because it looks clever, not because it looks smart, not because your CRM or marketing automation demo showed you something incredible that would be useful. Is what outcomes do you want? And then the thing that people miss is, once you've got the outcomes, what are you going to do with the outcomes, right? And it's like a cholesterol test, right? So I go get my cholesterol tested. Mr. Das, your cholesterol is high. I say, okay, what are you going to do about it? Well, what do you think I should do about it? And then 6 months again, oh, Mr. Das, your cholesterol's high again. Did you do what I told you to do? No, I didn't. Right? So it's almost like, how do you motivate people once they get the change, get the data, what are they going to do about it? And that behavioral element, that adoption that I think Andrew spoke about as well, that's the hardest thing. And when people talk about, the virtuous circle, they talk about brand, they talk about CRM, they talk about marketing automation. Ultimately, we're trying to change, it's behavioral change of the people that are using the system. Because essentially, we're giving them the old way, and here's the new way. And how many people want to go the new way? And that's where, Warren's, conversation about the narrative and all that kind of stuff, it all feeds in, and the storytelling all feeds into this. So, yeah, I hope I haven't sounded too depressing, but yeah, there we go. Cholesterol's back on order, by the way. It's all good.
Excellent. Well, great to hear. So for people who have good marketing cholesterol tests, they've mastered the virtuous circle. They've created a narrative, a story, and a brand. They have a brilliantly operating CRM, and their marketing automation is a juggernaut of client relationships. So that's the virtuous circle. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
Were there any questions, Rick, have come in?
Okay, so questions coming in, questions that are top of mind for anyone dealing with this. Let's say a firm is at the beginning, they have a deck, they have a website, they just started their CRM. What should they do to get this all moving?
That's a
What's
Warren.
their next best step?
That's a Warren. That's a Warren answer.
Okay, so we're talking specifically to new fund launches. I think again, we're going to go back to spend some time thinking about the story that you're going to tell. I would bring in the rest of your team in that discussion. I think it's important to have buy-in from the rest of your team. So where possible, that's a collaborative process to kind of put that story together. I think that down the line helps with consistency as well. And then I would start with the content first. I don't think you end up with the optimal design outcome if you don't consider the content first. So whether that be a website or a pitch deck, work on the content first. Make sure that there's a very good scaffolding there with powerful key messaging. Don't over-explain things. Don't use too much hyperbole. And provide that framework for the designers to then go and execute on. And I mean, if I have a starting point, it's website. I think everything kind of ties back to the website. All roads lead there. That's still where everyone goes to kind of have a first look at you. So make sure your website is in good nick. I think that's the starting point. You can follow on with the deck after that. And then just ensure that there's nice consistency between that collateral as well.
And then a concern we often hear about CRM is people might say, wow, it looked really great in the demo, but in real life, we don't know how to use it. Our team is struggling to figure out how to adapt it into their daily activities. What do we do to make this thing work?
Sure. So I think it's engaging with the vendor, right? And back to Paul's point is understanding what are the outcomes that you're looking for, right? So maybe the outcome is that we want to increase our activity, in our outreach to prospects, right? We're trying to raise capital, and that's the most important thing that we're going after. You have to think about how are we going to get there, right? It's probably reporting. It's ensuring that people are putting their information into the system, but then it's all the reporting that's driven off of that. So it's engaging with, hopefully a good team that can support getting you to that end goal. And then, like I said earlier, breaking it down into bite-sized pieces, right? If you're trying to do everything all at once, you're going to get lost, right? So it's understanding what are the clear day one goals. Hopefully, what are the day, 365-day goals, or 3-year goals, 5-year goals, but set those goals ahead of time and then break it down and engage with the vendor and ultimately put your hand up. If you're struggling to utilize the system, provide the vendor with that feedback. There's likely a solution that's already in place that they can implement or train. And if not, then vendors, not just ourselves, we love to hear feedback from clients, right? It helps guide our development pipeline. So I think just better engagement and not being afraid to put your hand up and saying, I don't understand, I'm struggling.
So put your hand up. Other things that some of our listeners have been putting their hand up about is they might say, my reporting team and my marketing team is overwhelmed with content demands. We've tried AI and now it's generic sounding. How do we find the balance between quality human content and these AI tools which are supposed to make our lives easier?
I mean, I think Andrew spoke to this earlier. He said that you start small, and from a content perspective, I think your audience tends to adapt to your frequency. So it's making sure that the frequency of content distribution or creation is manageable. I think a good rule of thumb is think about how long it's going to take and double that. But start small, set your frequency, stick to the frequency. Your user base, if you're only publishing once every 6 months, that's fine. As long as you stick to that, your investor will adapt. So start small and just be consistent.
And then another concern we often hear is, what mistake should I avoid? What's the biggest potholes? So how about a mistake or pothole from all four of you, one each, and then how can asset management marketers avoid that? Who wants the first pothole? How about you, Paul?
I think the first pothole would be, we've built a website, now what? Because I just see it all the time. And you ask them, you know, the people we're dealing with, it says, look, you know, do you have a fun narrative? No, we don't. Do you have a brand? No, we don't. Do you have content? No, we don't. And I think, and then the other pothole with that kind of follows that is they do it for the first 2 months and then they stop doing it. And it's just that discipline. So I think, you know, marketing needs discipline, and I think that would be it.
So marketing needs discipline. That's a solution to a pothole. How about you, Andrew, on the CRM side? What's a typical big pothole people fall into, and what words of wisdom do you have to help them?
I really think it's probably, and this is probably beyond CRM, but just not having a plan in place, right? And kind of saying, okay, I checked the box, like Paul said earlier, and I have a CRM now, but they haven't really thought about, you know, what does that mean and how can I leverage it? You know, oftentimes I think it's thought of, you know, maybe people make the mistake that it still is just a data repository, right? So it's about, you know, staying engaged with the vendor, staying engaged with, you know, what new functionality there is, and then thinking about how can I apply that to my business processes to ultimately go out and raise more money.
And Warren, what would you say is the biggest pothole on the branding and content side people should avoid?
Slightly left field, but I think a lot of firms will invest heavily in their marketing function, particularly the collateral that they're developing. So your website, your pitch deck, your investor communications. But I mean, at the end of the day, what is the role of that marketing? Well, it's, you know, investors don't buy funds based purely on marketing. At the end of the day, you're going to need to get someone in front of that investor, and they're going to have to tell your story. And I think a lot of investment goes into creating the collateral sometimes, and not enough time is spent on the actual pitch. So the person who is pitching that fund, they need to be an expert communicator. They really need to know how to use body language, how to use their tone of voice. You listen to Paul speaking, and you'll get an inclination of how that should sound. But you know, it's so critical. It comes down to how you are telling your story. And if you put all that investment, you get your foot in the door, and the person who's presenting doesn't stand up there and do a good job, it's all kind of wasted, isn't it? So, you know, marketing gets you a foot in the door, but geez, you need people up front who are well trained to be expert communicators. Yes.
Okay, so everyone needs to be an expert communicator. Yeah, another concern we often hear is, who can afford this? A money management organization will say, we put all our resources into running a great portfolio, delivering great performance. The sales team is becoming more expensive day by day. Who the heck has the money for marketing? How do we fund this? Why should we pay this? Is it worth it?
Well, we're based in South Africa, so you can afford it.
I go back to that quote. It's not the best wins, it's the best known fund. And if you're not spending that money, somebody else somewhere is.
And I think, Rick, it can be done piecemeal, right? So you don't have to do the entire thing in one go. Start with your website, get that running, then build a little bit of momentum on performance if you can, and then, you know, start building these things out piecemeal. You don't have to do it all at one go. And in fact, I think if you're trying to do that, you're probably going to overwhelm the people who are responsible for those projects. So do it piecemeal, but as Paul said, you don't want to do it twice.
Step by step. And how about on the CRM side, Andrew? How should people think about the expense, the marginal expense of going from scratching things into a spreadsheet to having a fully operational CRM?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but it takes money to make money. And I think most people in this industry understand that. Like Paul said, there's so much competition nowadays. The number of new launches year after year continues to grow. And it's not just on pedigree alone anymore. There's so many people out there. It's a family tree, right? As you kind of go generation by generation, how many Tiger great grandchildren are there nowadays, right? So it's not just the pedigree, it's not just the performance. You're really competing on, again, going back, is my firm institutional? If you're not institutional, you will not be able to raise money. A good example, I used to, first job out of college, I day traded for about 3.5 years during the financial crisis. Great learning experience. did it for somewhat successfully for a few years. Had a couple colleagues who did it far more successfully, right? And they raised, were able to make millions and millions of dollars on their own as 23, 24-year-old kids. They decided probably 7 or 8 years ago, I got a call from one of them. He said, we started a hedge fund. We wanted to go out and raise external capital. We're struggling, right? What do we do? And so I went and I saw they had a fund administrator out of Sagamore Beach, not to call anyone out, but I'd never heard of this fund administrator before. They didn't have any sort of business team supporting them, right? There's 2 traders. And I said, I hate to break it to you guys, but you really need to rethink your whole business model here. And they said, oh, no, we can do this on our own. They're no longer running their hedge fund, right? So, and these were very, very talented traders. So you really have to commit to the business side of it, and it takes money. So I mean, I would say, how can you afford not to?
And then on the flip side, we often hear people ask, well, how can I be great at this? If you had to give someone one short piece of advice, how to be great at this, what would that be? Warren, do you want to start? I'll put you on the.
I think it goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about being authentic, about having the courage to be disliked. I think if you want to resonate with a target audience, you have to take risk. It's like investing. You can't make returns if you don't take risk. So I would just say, be a little bit risky with the messaging that you're putting out there. Be authentic, be yourself. Tell people what you are and what you aren't.
And how about you, Andrew? Best practice.
I think the only way to get great at anything is through repetition, right? So you have to start somewhere, dive on in and start trying to implement these processes. Work on your message and refine it, right? Again, I'm not a marketer. I'm not creating a brand, but like Warren just said, you have to start somewhere. Start simple, be authentic. It's the same with using software. We don't expect you to be a technologist or a designer or a coder, right? But you still should just get comfortable that this is part of your process. And the more you do it, the better you're going to get.
And Paul, among your clients, and you have a number of them at different stages of their marketing development, what differentiates the great ones?
Always be learning. Always be learning. Humility. Those are the guys that win, and they're disciplined because their content, just like Warren said, there's a cadence to the content they produce. It doesn't overwhelm them. They know what they're doing. They've got buy-in from leadership. And I think that's key. If there's anything you want to do, buy-in from leadership, demonstrate the impact marketing is having on raising assets. They'll do anything. If you can demonstrate that, that's all you need.
Well, those are all wise words. Thank you again, everyone. I think we've taught our audience, our listeners, how to master the virtuous circle in fund marketing.
And thank you, Rick.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.